Okay, welcome back. You've mastered the phone screen and the deep dive career interview. And this is where most people would stop. I had a great interview, I found my head of marketing, she was amazing. But more often than not, they'd be wrong because they're skipping a vital part of the interview process, and that's the DNA interview. Now in Module 2, we talked about why it's so crucial to find that DNA match with your company. That's not the purpose of the deep dive interview. That's the purpose of this phase. Does the candidate's DNA match your company's DNA? How are they really hardwired? What are they really made of? Will they be successful here? That's a totally different thing, and that's the purpose of the DNA interview. Now, each DNA interview is 60 minutes in length. And who does the DNA interview? Well, you already know that, right? Because you developed this interview team. The one hiring manager does the deep dive interview, and the other 3 people are each doing a DNA interview. So you've already know who those people are because they were involved in creating the scorecard. Resist the temptation to insert some new last-minute interviewer in the process. It always slows things down. Another thing that doesn't work is the panel interview. Clients ask me all the time, can I use a panel interview to try to save time? The answer is no. Studies show that individual one-on-one interviews are actually more accurate than group or panel interviews. Plus, they can really trip up an otherwise great candidate. Remember, we're looking for a great candidate, not a great interviewer. So panel interviews just don't work. Also, during the DNA interview, don't repeat the career deep dive. We're looking for new information that'll increase our accuracy of our decision. Don't ask the same questions that you asked during the deep dive. And by the way, that's really something that turns off candidates. You'll hear candidates that have the same questions over and over and over. It's pretty frustrating. So what we're asking and why we're asking it, well, I've included those in the briefcase, but let me give you a quick overview so you understand the intent. As you'd expect, the core of the DNA interview is to assess the candidate's DNA. Are they wired like our DNA? And to do that, I divide up the DNA that we defined earlier amongst the 3 interviewers. So each of them is going to have 1 or 2 characteristics that they're looking for, and they will drill and drill and drill during that interview to assess. Now, someone can fake DNA with a superficial answer and kind of a bogus answer, but pretty soon the person's true character reveals itself. By asking that for example after example, I can tell if someone is fearless or tireless or selfless. And my clients are consistently surprised by how revealing this simple technique is. Once all the interviewers have finished the DNA interview, we're going to debrief. Now that happens in person, not on an email chain or a phone call. And we're going to actually debate and discuss. That needs to be when it's fresh, so within 24 hours. And it's going to be an honest conversation where we're going to bring and use and rely on our scorecards. And we're going to talk about the candidate's pros and cons. There's no perfect candidate, so we actually need to debate and discuss that. When one person says, I really liked that candidate, the other should challenge them and challenge them for specifics. Well, what do you mean I like them? Let's go back to the scorecard and look at both competencies and DNA. We also need to decide the rules ahead of time. Now, this is where it gets difficult. Who is making this decision? Who actually owns the hire? Who has input into the decision and who has no input at all? Do they have veto rights or just a say? Far easier to discuss this ahead of time than to wait to the very end when we're stuck with 2 finalist candidates and don't know how to proceed. I'm often asked, should I have my staff members interview their prospective manager? I don't do that. I have found that in general, it's not a good idea for people to interview their prospective manager. Now, I'm not against people meeting their prospective manager, perhaps an informational discussion or let's take them to lunch, but if they don't have a say in the process, that's not an interview, that's just a meet and greet. So be really clear about that. Now, a few other things about the interview process before we wrap up. Just as in dating, we're going to spend progressively more time with candidates that hold promise. So there's the phone screen, then we go to the next step of the deep dive interview, then the DNA interview, and you'll see in the next module we'll continue that. Next, focus on how. I'm looking for details on how the candidate did things. How did things transpire, right? So when a candidate answers a question, I ask, well, how did you do that? How did you make that happen? What challenges did you observe or have to overcome during the process? And then I can validate that information later in reference checks. I also focus on why. That helps me understand their decision making, their judgment. Why did you take this role? Why did you leave this role? Why did you choose this project? Why did you choose this path? That helps identify their cognitive ability, their true motivators. Finally, I look for experiential, not hypothetical. Past experience is the best predictor of success. Asking candidate future questions, what would you do if, are interesting, but the candidate just doesn't know enough, so it can't be as predictive as what did you do and how did you do it over many years. Again, I'm writing down all this information and every name they mention, creating the reference list as we go. So it's time for your homework. Number 1, review the DNA interview guide that's in the online briefcase. Become familiar with the questions. Number 2, by now you should have already scheduled and had that DNA meeting with your core team. And if not, it's time to stop this process and go back to Module 2, Lesson 3, and get that meeting on the books. Every day that you delay is another bad hire that you risk making. The end goal of this is to get from 5 candidates down to a final 2, and we're going to put them through our test drive. That's the focus of our next module. But first, I want to congratulate you. We're halfway through this course, and we're not there yet, but I'm really impressed with your steady progress. I will see you at the test drive.